Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, which is all about race. Race can be defined as a group of people who share a set of characteristics, usually physical ones, and are said to share a common bloodline. Racism is the belief that members of separate races possess different and unequal human traits. Race is a social construct that changes over time and across different contexts. To be white in America, for example, changed from being a somewhat inclusive category in the late 18th century to being much more narrowly defined in the mid to late 19th century, and then shifted back to a broader definition in the mid 20th century. All of these changes were a response to social realities. When we think about the concept of race, we're going to look from the ancients to the Ellies. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the idea of race did not exist as we know today. People recognized broad physical differences between groups of people, but they did not discriminate based on those differences. As Europeans came into contact with different peoples and cultures during the Age of Exploration, racism was used to justify the conquest and colonization of foreign lands. In the 19th century, there were a number of scientists and thinkers researching and attempting to explain racial differences. Many of their efforts were biased due to ethnocentrism, or the judgment of other groups by one's own standards and values. So they were actually explaining white superiority. Social Darwinism, another 19th century theory, was the notion that some groups or races had evolved more than others and were better fit to survive and even rule than other races. Backers of eugenics, or the science of genetic lines and the inheritable traits they pass on from generation to generation, claimed that traits could be traced through bloodlines and bred into for positive traits or out of for negative traits relating to populations. This thinking influenced immigration policy in the early 20th century, when undesirable populations were kept out of the country so they wouldn't pollute the quote-unquote native or white population. The one-drop rule, which evolved from the US laws forbidding miscegenation, which was the belief that one drop of Black blood makes a person Black. Application of this rule kept the white population quote-unquote pure and lumped anyone with Black blood into one category. When we look at miscegenation, this is the technical term for a multiracial marriage. Today, DNA testing is used to determine people's racial makeup, and while this process may be more accurate on some level than 19th century racial measures, it still supports the notion of biological racial differences. Let's look at some racial realities. Racialization is the formation of a new racial identity in which new ideological boundaries of difference are drawn around a formerly unnoticed group of people. A recent example of racialization is the anti-Muslim backlash in America since 9/11. Being Muslim is linked in the mind of Americans to being Arab, so anyone who quote-unquote looks Arab, for men, it's often linked to skin color or facial hair and perhaps clothing. And for women, it's often linked to the use of a headscarf. When we look at this, anyone who looks Arab is thought to be Muslim and therefore anti-American. Now let's look at race versus ethnicity. Race is imposed, usually based on physical differences, hierarchical, exclusive, and unequal. Ethnicity is voluntarily self-defined, non-hierarchical, fluid, cultural, and not so closely linked with power differences. An ethnic identity becomes racialized when it's subsumed under a forced label, racial marker, or quote-unquote otherness. We also have symbolic ethnicity. This is ethnicity that is individualistic in nature and without real social cost for the individual. Whites who explore and express an affinity for their European roots can be said to be adopting a symbolic ethnicity. It makes them feel good about their heritage, and it's something that they can focus on and express when they choose to. It isn't an identity that they must assume all the time. Let's look at some ethnic groups in the United States today. European colonizers decimated Native American populations through war and the introduction of new diseases, as well as through the practice of forced assimilation, whereby Native American children were put into government-run schools and taught to reject their culture and embrace Anglo culture. Today, Native Americans are on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. The Black community in America is marked by high rates of poverty, crime, unemployment, incarceration, and health problems. The community is also expanding as new immigrants from Africa and even quote-unquote old immigrants from the Caribbean resist being lumped together with African Americans. The Latino population in America is very diverse, though one common trait is that most Latino immigrants have come to the United States voluntarily in search of economic opportunity. Latinos have a somewhat ambiguous racial identity. Sometimes they're grouped with whites and sometimes not. Then we look at Asian Americans. The first wave of Asian immigrants to the United States is in the mid-19th century, and they were made up of mostly unskilled laborers. The current second wave consists primarily of well-educated and highly skilled people from all over Asia. Asians are unique among the US minorities in that they generally achieve a higher economic status. And finally, we have Middle Eastern Americans. When we look at Middle Eastern Americans, something for us to note, as we just spoke about, is that for many Middle Eastern Americans, they are often essentially based on racialization. They're trying to come up with a new racial identity so that they're not mislabeled as being from somewhere that they aren't, and to be discriminated against and stereotyped against. When we look at Middle Eastern Americans, it's important for us to understand that they are typically, like all of the other ethnic groups that we just talked about, when we look at the mainstream media, they're typically put down, they are stereotyped negatively, and that can lead to discrimination and even violence against them. For Middle Eastern Americans, this is certainly true, especially in part since 9/11. White people, they're not identified first and foremost by their attachment to a specific race, so they have more flexibility and power to choose how they want to be identified. Being the dominant race, they don't have to think about race much at all. The development of whiteness studies is important because it shows that being white, something that has been held up as a standard of normality or neutrality, is as much a social construction as any other racial category. Now let's look at some minority-majority group relations. Robert Park's 1920 straight-line assimilation model involved 4 stages: contact, competition, accommodation, and assimilation. In 1964, Milton Gordon offered a variation on Park's model, one that involved 7 stages that immigrants could pass through or become stuck in. Gordon did not assume that full assimilation was always the outcome. In short, when we look at Robert Park's concept of the straight line assimilation, essentially what he was talking about is that his ideology is that how people come to the United States is universal and linear. So for immigrants, they first arrive, they then settle in, and they achieve full assimilation in a newly homogeneous country. For Milton Gordon's alternative model of assimilation, he proposed that there are 7 stages of assimilation that happen. The first is acculturation. New immigrants adopt language, dress, and daily customs of the host society, including values and norms. Second is structural assimilation. There's large-scale entrance of minorities into cliques, clubs, and institutions in the host society. Third is marital assimilation, where there's widespread intermarriage between immigrants and natives. Fourth is identification assimilation, where the minority feels bonded to the dominant culture. Fifth is attitude reception assimilation, which refers to the absence of prejudice. Sixth is behavior reception assimilation, which refers to the absence of discrimination. And the seventh stage is civic assimilation, which occurs when there's an absence of value conflicts and power struggles. Ethnic identification can persist even after a group has become fairly well assimilated. One explanation for this phenomenon is what's called primordialism. This is the ethnic ties that are fixed in a deeply felt connection to one's homeland culture. Another is that it is in people's interest to maintain a strong ethnic identification because it serves as a type of interest group to promote and protect its members. There's also this concept of pluralism. In the context of race and ethnicity, pluralism refers to the presence and engaged coexistence of numerous distinct groups in one society, with no one group in the majority. Next, we have segregation. This is the legal or social practice of separating people on the basis of their race or ethnicity. Segregation was official policy in the United States, particularly in the South, until 1965. But despite being illegal for over 40 years, there's still ample evidence of segregation in America's society today, particularly in schools, housing, and in prisons. This here, figure 9.3, looks at the index of racial dissimilarity. And what this means is that it measures the degree of segregation in a given city. A value under 30 is low, one between 30 and 60 is medium, and one over 60 is high. So something that we see is that we find that over time, Boston has actually sort of maintained in the 60-ish race, which is still relatively high. Chicago was low and has become high. And New Orleans was low back in 1860, but has gotten high. While the highest rates were in 1940, you can still see as of 2010 that they are still relatively high and still higher than in 1860, showing that even today, almost 200 years later or 150 years later, that we still have high levels of segregation that occur. The most contentious form of minority-majority group relations is, of course, outright conflict. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a natural, racial, political, or cultural group. So there are 4 ways in which groups respond to oppression, and they're withdrawing, passing, acceptance, and resistance. Something for us to think about is that acceptance and resistance can be closely linked, as members of an oppressed group might appear to accept their subordinate position while internally they feel enormous resentment. Overt collective resistance can take the form of revolution, nonviolent protest, or riots. When we look at withdrawing and passing in oppression, withdrawing means that they withdraw from the dominant group and form their own smaller subgroup, typically falling under the radar. And passing is where they leave their home group to go with the dominant group. We also have prejudice and discrimination. This is part of the new racism. Prejudice is negative thoughts and feelings about an ethnic or racial group. Discrimination is harmful or negative acts against people deemed inferior on the basis of their racial category. While overt racism is, for the most part, considered unacceptable in American society today, a new kind of racism is on the rise in America and elsewhere. Often called colorblind racism, it focuses on cultural and national differences rather than racial ones. Something that happens is that in colorblind racism, we fail to see the physical characteristics of race, and instead we presume that there's something fixed, innate, and inferior about non-white cultural values, that we fail to see that there are differences, and by failing to see those differences, we are taking the lived experiences of people who have been harmed by race. We devalue those experiences, and we choose to turn a blind eye to them, not accept them at all. So, how race matters. Let's look at the case of wealth. There's a wealth gap that exists between white and minority groups in America that has historical roots and can't be overcome simply through income inequality. When we look at this, look at the fact that in 2016, the average household net worth was $17,100 in African Americans, $20,600 in Latino families, but whites had $171,000 of net worth. That's 10 times more than African Americans and 9 times more than Latinos. That's problematic in and of itself. That also goes to show that race and ethnicity can also impact education, occupation, income, wealth, socioeconomic status, and other opportunities. When we look at public policies, they are formulated to address white and non-white disparities that have not paid enough attention to the particular legacy of racism. So something that stems from this is called institutional racism. This is how institutions and social dynamics may seem race neutral, but actually continue to disadvantage minority groups in things like education, occupation, geographical location, age, race, ethnicity, all the opportunities that could be afforded to people who are considered non-white or Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and Middle Eastern American. They lose out on opportunities because of institutional racism. In 2000, the US Census created separate categories for race and ethnicity, and for the first time allowed people to check off more than one box for racial identity. These changes have given us a better idea of the diversity of the American population. When you look here at figure 9.6, this is the race question from the 2010 census, which is very similar, actually the same, as the 2020 census. When we look at this ethnic snapshot of America in 2016, while the majority at 62% is still white non-Hispanic, we are seeing that there is a rise, especially of Hispanic and Latino origins. But we also see that still 38% are considered minorities in America. It's predicted that by 2050, whites will no longer be a majority in the United States. This change could bring about a narrowing of the definition of white, similar to what happened in the 19th century, as whites tried to come up with boundaries around their group in relation to growing minorities. Many of the court decisions that were instrumental in implementing the ability for people to have interfaith and interracial marriages in America, they've been struck down or restricted over the past few years, leading to significant levels of resegregation in public schools. This doesn't bode well for minority students, as research has shown that they benefit from being in racially mixed schools. Desegregation is something that is important, especially in education, occupation, and other related fields. Without having full desegregation, we are still going to find that these racial and ethnic disparities will continue to take place, including discrimination and harm against minority groups. What I would love for you to answer in the questions in the comment section below is, what can we do? What is one thing that we can do to help ensure that segregation does not come back in the United States or even the global culture? What's one thing that you would suggest? Put your comments in the comment section below, and I'll offer you one extra credit point. Until next time, I hope that you have a great day. Remember to be kind to yourself and others, and to work smarter, not harder. Have a great one, y'all.